Close the door here. Hello, everyone. Are we audible?
Yes, we are. The live stream has started and we'll begin the event in just a couple minutes. Thank you.
Well, good morning. I'm U.S. Election Assistance Commission Chairman Don Palmer. I think we got everybody. So thank you everyone for participating in this virtual roundtable on the newly released EAC and Rutgers University fact sheet titled Disability and Voter Turnout in the 2020 Election and the Lessons Learned in Election Accessibility. This fact sheet should be prominently placed on our website, and I encourage all listeners and election officials to review the summary of the data and the report from the 2020 election if you have the opportunity, and it's great reading. Today's event and the release of the fact sheet are particularly timely with the upcoming 31st anniversary of the ADA on July 26th. And we hope this event and the data shared today contribute to the conversations on accessibility this month and beyond. So earlier this year, the EAC published the EAC and Rutgers study, Disability and Voting Accessibility in the 2020 Elections. And we hosted a virtual roundtable to discuss those findings. Recently, we expanded on that study by accessing the data at a more granular level, leading to the release of this fact sheet that examines takeaways from data on turnout rates of voters with disabilities in the 2020 election. Now, we're eager to share those findings with you today. To begin today's discussion, we'll hear opening remarks from my fellow commissioners and then Professor Lisa Schur and Professor Doug Cruz, who will present on the findings of this new study. Now, thank you very much, Professor Schur and Professor Cruz, for your continued hard work on this important topic. In addition to the Rutgers presentation on the new accessibility fact sheet, we will exchange some thoughts and opinions to the key lessons learned regarding accessibility during the 2020 election, how election officials can use this data to inform their work in serving voters. So ensuring accessibility for voters with disabilities is fundamental to the EAC's mission and one of the highest priorities that we champion. The EAC continues to partner with election officials and stakeholders to advance access to the ballot for all voters, and we view today's event as an important piece of that work. After receiving additional funding this spring, the EAC was able to hire Ben Jackson, who is also joining us today for this discussion as a subject matter expert focused solely on accessibility. Now, Ben will be joining us today to discuss the EAC accessibility related priorities. We're looking forward to hearing his thoughts on the newly released fact sheet and the summary of the data. Studies like this one that we will discuss today provide a valuable snapshot of what worked and the gaps that remain when it comes to serving voters with disabilities and helping those voters cast a private and independent ballot. And although there are still obstacles for voters with disabilities, very happy to see that during an especially difficult election year, turnout among voters with disabilities surged in 2020. So today's roundtable is part of that ongoing conversation about ensuring accessible voting. The data released today will also help the EAC improve and inform resources and guidance materials while measuring the progress made by election officials as they serve voters with disabilities. So thank you to our speakers and everyone viewing this discussion online. I'd like to ask EAC Vice Chairman Tom Hicks for some opening remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Palmer, and thank you to our speakers today. The Help America Vote Act established a clear mandate to ensure Americans with disabilities be given the same opportunities to vote independently and privately, the EAC was entrusted with leadership in this area. The EAC hosted several accessibility events last year and distributed resources for election officials working to ensure voters with disabilities were not forgotten during the pandemic. I look forward to the continued expansion of the EAC's efforts in this area. The EAC and Rutgers study on accessibility in the 2020 elections provided us all with critical information about the accessibility of the vote for millions of Americans with disabilities during this historic election. As mentioned earlier, we are encouraged to see the increase in turnout for voters with disabilities in 2020, as many election officials work to quickly pivot and add accessible voting for voters. I hope that with today's release, we can further build on the work of the EAC and election officials across the country as we strive to ensure equal access to the independent and private vote for voters with disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair Hicks. Commissioner McCormick, do you have some comments?
Thank you, Chairman Palmer. I would like to echo the statements of my fellow commissioners that have already been made. And although there's been an increase in accessibility for voters with disabilities, we recognize that there are still opportunities for further enhancements. Through dedication to accessibility and collaboration, today's findings show election officials were able to maintain a high level of access and expand turnout for all voters, including those with disabilities, across disability types and demographic categories. Events like today's allow us to identify where we, as a federal agency, can best assist election officials as they balance the many competing needs of their jurisdictions while working to ensure access for voters with disabilities. We're excited to hear more from Professor Schor and Professor Cruz about the important lessons we can take from the 2020 election, building upon the important findings of the accessibility in the 2020 election study from earlier this year. I'd like to thank our speakers for their work on this report and for joining us today, and I look forward to hearing from them. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Commissioner McCormick. Commissioner Hovland, do you have some opening remarks?
Thank you, Chairman Palmer. As my fellow commissioners have mentioned, we at the EAC are specifically charged with helping election officials to ensure access for voters with disabilities. We take this responsibility seriously, strive to fulfill the Help America Vote Act's mandate to the fullest extent, and work continually to improve how we can support election officials as they serve the 38 million voters with disabilities across the United States. Today's findings help provide a deeper understanding of the number of voters who still faced voting difficulties despite the 2020 election's expanded options to cast a ballot. This data, along with feedback from our Standards Board and Board of Advisors, as well as subject matter experts on staff, will help the EAC to continue to expand and improve our resources for election officials in this area. I look forward to hearing from Professor Schor and Cruz about the important lessons we can learn from 2020 as we develop additional resources to assist election officials in working to eliminate barriers to voting for the millions of Americans with disabilities. Thank you. Chairman Palmer.
Thank you, Commissioner Hovland. Thank you, commissioners. I'd like to turn this now over to Professors Lisa Schor and Douglas Cruz from the Rutgers University Program for Disability Research, who are joining us today to discuss their new findings, the new data and findings from their recent study. Professor Schor and Cruz have done extensive work in this field beyond their recent work with EAC, and as experts in the field and with their experience executing research on the topic, I think there's a lot of valuable information to be shared, not only with us, but with the public. And so I thank you for your ongoing commitment to raising the awareness and advancing the rights of people with disabilities. Professor Doug Cruz is the director of the Program for Disability Research at Rutgers University, and Professor Lisa Schor is the director of the Program for Disability Research, Rutgers University. So I'm going to turn this over to you for your presentation. Go ahead, and I think you can share your PowerPoint, and we'll get this set up. Great.
Yeah.
There you go.
Good morning, everyone. We're going to do a bit of a tag team presentation. I will start. Thank you so much for having us here today. You're doing important work. As you said, we are looking at disability and voter turnout in the 2020 elections. So our main questions were, how likely were people with disabilities to vote in 2020? Among people who voted, how many used ballots or the option of voting early? We're talking about people with disabilities. And how did the 2020 turnout compare to past elections? So to answer these and other questions, we analyzed data from the November 2020 voting and registration supplement in the Census Bureau's current population survey. And it contains responses from 81,898 voting eligible citizens, including 11,000 citizens with disabilities. And we compare that to data from 2016, when there was a similar large sample and comparable numbers of people with disabilities. How do we define disability? It's defined in the census surveys by a yes response to one or more of 6 questions that ask whether people have a hearing impairment, a visual impairment, a mental or cognitive impairment, difficulty walking or climbing stairs, difficulty inside the home with tasks such as dressing or bathing, or difficulty going outside doing errands alone. Our key result: voter turnout surged in 2020 among people with disabilities. There was an increase of 5.9 percentage points from 2016, and that's compared to an increase of 5.3 points for people without disabilities. So we estimate that 17.7 million people with disabilities voted in 2020, and that represents 11.4% of all voters. And what's very interesting is that the surge occurred across the major types of disability. And I just want to highlight 2 of them: people with mental or cognitive impairments and people who have difficulty going outside alone. And historically, these are the groups that have had particularly low turnout. So we were glad to see that that surge was particularly evident among these groups. But people with disabilities are still less likely than people without disabilities to vote, although the disability turnout gap may have narrowed slightly. So you can see that among people with disabilities, we have 61.8% voting in 2020, and that's compared to 67.5% among people without disabilities. So this disability turnout gap is large enough to be outside the margin of error for both years, 2016 and 2020. Although, again, the change in the gap from 2016 to 2020 was within the margin of error, so we can't be highly confident that the gap is actually closing. So why is there this persistent disability turnout gap? It is not explained by lower interest in politics and elections among people with disabilities, as shown by polls. Past research shows that the gap is partly explained by lower resources, especially income and education. Greater social isolation: people with disabilities are more likely to live alone, they're less likely to be employed, they're less likely to participate regularly in groups. A lower belief that the political system is responsive to people like themselves, and also voting difficulties. So we worked with the EAC on a 2020 post-election national survey with 2,569 respondents. Results on voter turnout and method were very similar between this survey and the census data. And in addition, as you said, looking more granularly, the EAC survey found that 1 in 9, that's 11% of voters with disabilities in 2020, said that they experienced difficulties in voting, and that's almost twice the rate of voters without disabilities, 6%. Now, combined with the census turnout data, we estimate that 1.95 million people with disabilities encountered difficulties voting in 2020. Now, this is a significant improvement from a similar 2012 survey, where over a quarter, 26% of voters with disabilities reported problems, compared to 7% of voters without disabilities. At least half of the improvement was due to the greater accessibility of polling places since 2012, while the other half resulted from a shift to increased mail-in voting during the pandemic. I'll turn it over to Doug here. Yeah.
Okay, I'm also very happy to be here. We're very pleased to be working with the EAC on this. The method of voting, obviously there's a big shift to voting by mail during the pandemic this last year. People with disabilities are historically more likely than those without disabilities to vote by mail. Analyzing last year's data, we found that only 1/4, 26% of voters with disabilities voted at a polling place on election day, compared to 31% of voters without disabilities. I can't resist adding here that, as Lisa said, the results were pretty similar between, were very similar actually between the survey that we did with the EAC on voting accessibility and the census data. And in fact, these 26% and 31% numbers are identical between the two surveys, right down to the 10th of a decimal place. So very, very happy to see that.
Yeah.
So that gives some validation to the earlier survey as well. Voters with disabilities were also less likely to vote early at a polling place or election office, 21% compared to 27%. And correspondingly, they were more likely to vote by mail, 53% compared to 42%, 11 points gap. The increase in voting by mail between 2016 and 2020 was actually similar between voters with disabilities, an increase of 24 points, and those without disabilities, 22 points. Voting by mail is not easy for everyone. In the EAC Rutgers survey, 22% of people with visual impairments reported difficulty voting with the mail ballot. So we do some breakdowns by demographic factors with that large sample in the census survey. The surge in turnout among people with disabilities occurred across major demographic categories among both women and men with disabilities, Blacks, Hispanic Latinx, white, non-Hispanic Latinx, and other Asian, Native American, and so forth. Across age groups, 18 to 34, 35 to 49, 50 to 64, and 65 or older, and across the regions. Interestingly, as in past elections, there was no turnout gap between employed people with and without disabilities. And this is something we're particularly interested in. Employment appears to play a very positive role in political inclusion, as well as economic inclusion of people with disabilities, in increasing their incomes and social connections. Voter registration, the census data have information on voter registration as well as turnout. Eligible citizens with disabilities in 2020 were 3 points less likely to be registered to vote than those without disabilities, 70% compared to 73%. And all these differences are statistically significant outside the margin of error. Among those who were registered, people with disabilities were 4 points less likely to vote, 88 compared to 92%. So what this means is that the overall disability turnout gap, that gap of 5.7 points, is due both to lower registration and to lower turnout among those registered to vote. Registered people with disabilities were more likely than those without disabilities to register at a town hall or election office, and less likely to register at a Department of Motor Vehicles. People with disabilities are less likely to have driver's licenses, and they have more transportation issues. Asked why they did not register, non-registered people with disabilities were more likely to give permanent illness or disability as a reason, and less likely than those without disabilities to say they were not interested in the election or that they did not meet registration deadlines. The last substantive slide I'll give here, reasons for not voting. Among those who were registered but did not vote, just over 1/3 of people with disabilities said they did not vote because of the illness or disability, their own or their families. They were less likely than non-voters without disabilities to say they were not interested, did not like the candidates or campaign issues, or were too busy. The coronavirus was obviously a concern for all of us this last year. The percent saying they did not vote due to concerns about the coronavirus was similar between people with and without disabilities. 5% compared to 4%. And that was within the margin of error, that difference. So the key takeaways here, as we see it, voter turnout surged in 2020 among people with disabilities, indicating that despite the barriers they often face, people with disabilities are just as interested in elections as people without disabilities, and they turn out to vote when motivated. I think that's very, very important to know. A turnout gap remained, however, between people with and without disabilities in 2020, combined with results on voting difficulties from the survey we did earlier, post-election survey. An estimated 1.95 million voters with disabilities encountered some type of difficulty voting in the 2020 elections. We found, as I just was discussing, people with disabilities were more likely than those without disabilities to use a mail ballot. Well, the increase in mail ballots during the pandemic was similar to voters with and without disabilities, but mail ballots are not a panacea. And we think this is a very important point. The large variation in types and severity of disabilities means that one size fits all does not work for many people. Having more options in how to vote will help the turnout of people with disabilities. If there are more options, there's a greater likelihood that someone with a particular disability will find an option that works well for them. Past research indicates that inaccessible voting systems can discourage turnout, not only making it more difficult to vote, but also through psychological effects by sending the message that people with disabilities are not welcome in the political sphere. The improved accessibility since 2012 is likely to have helped turnout among people with disabilities in 2020, which reflects well on the efforts of the EAC, election officials, policymakers, disability organizations. But as several of the commissioners said, there's a need for continued progress in improving accessibility and ensuring people with disabilities can easily exercise the right to vote. So we, of course, welcome any questions and the opportunity to make these results as useful as possible for improving civic participation and access to voting. And I will stop sharing.
Well, thank you. Before we get into questions, I'm going to introduce Ben Jackson, who's our senior subject matter expert in accessibility. And as I mentioned in the intro, the EAC recently hired Ben Jackson as our senior subject matter in this area. And he has an experience as an attorney and a policy specialist and focused on disability policy. Now, he's the first EAC member focused solely on accessibility work, and he's going to lead an internal team to ensure accessibility permeates our culture here at the EAC and informs all the products we provide. I think that this is a great initiative. And he's also going to serve as an expert resource to inform our work product designed to assist our stakeholders, including election officials, as well as to inform accessibility related policy matters in the VVSG, and ultimately to address the needs of a growing community. And that's one thing I took away from this, is this growing community of voters with disabilities as our elections continue to evolve. Thank you for joining us today, Ben. Do you have a few remarks generally and about the presentation we just heard?
Yes, and thank you, Chairman Palmer and commissioners, for the opportunity to give brief remarks today. As Chairman Palmer noted, I am the first subject matter expert for accessibility at the EAC, and my sole focus will be to ensure that, again, accessibility permeates the culture of the EAC and its work products. I also want to thank the professors for the research, and I wanted to highlight one particularly compelling point that I think we should focus on, is that of the estimated 17.7 million voters with disabilities that cast ballots in the 2020 general election, approximately 1.9 million of those experienced difficulty voting. So while these voters were not completely disenfranchised, there is still room for improvement. And I want to take time out to thank advocates and election workers for their tireless effort and for assisting closing the gap between voters with disabilities and voters without disabilities. Also, as the commissioner has mentioned, or the chairman has mentioned, the EAC has established an accessibility working group that will be tasked with updating, maintaining, and ensuring the accuracy of the EAC accessibility related clearinghouse materials. This working group includes not only experts on accessibility, but also technology. So we're looking to, wed these two areas to ensure that the larger initiatives that we launch designed to provide accessibility will naturally have both the influence from the technology sector, but also ensure that there is accessibility throughout. And these resources are going to be geared to election officials, voters, and advocates. I think another key point based on the findings of the study is that there's a gap in voter registration rate and participation amongst voters with disabilities and those without disabilities. And as the EAC subject matter expert for accessibility, I'll be doing research into best practices and disseminating information that I believe will be helpful to close these gaps. Finally, I think that in addition to providing best practices, we also hope to produce a checklist to assist election officials to ensure that the entire electoral process is accessible for voters with disabilities. So that's from voter registration through ballot verification. So that's the end of my brief remarks. Thank you, Chairman Palmer and commissioners again for your time, but happy to turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Jackson. To begin the Q&A, I'd like to ask a question. It's actually going to be a little bit of a double question because something really struck me during your presentation, and it really is to see if we have the data on it. So I think that the survey and the report is really a reflection on the great work of election officials and that participation that we saw with voters with disabilities. However, you did point out that a third of registered voters with a disability cited their illness as a reason for not voting. And that's 3 times as much as non-disabled voters. And so what steps do you think can be taken to increase that disparity? And before I let you answer that question, I really was struck by the data that showed that there had been improvements to the accessibility to the polling places. Yet there are still some folks that had some challenges and difficulty. Was your survey able to highlight what those difficulties were? I mean, are we talking about the accessibility of the polling place itself, the polling, the voting equipment, someone to assist them? What if you have that data? I'd like to know a little bit more. But I sorry to hit you with 2 questions, but I'd like you to see if you could.
Want to start?
Sure, those are very good questions. Regarding those specific problems, we did break those out in the survey we did earlier and found that when the most common problems that people with disabilities had were difficulty reading or understanding the ballot or understanding how to vote. That there were also problems with getting into the polling place, particularly with people with mobility impairments. Now, the really remarkable thing is that we did this survey and the post-election survey in 2012 as well, and found, as we've discussed, the improvement in accessibility. The improvement particularly occurred in those big problems of difficulty understanding or reading or seeing the ballot, or difficulty understanding how to vote. And those are things that the election officials have a lot of control over, is explaining things and making ballots easy to see and easy to read. So we think that's evidence of some good progress by the election officials in those most important problems that people with disabilities face.
Yeah, I just want to mention that one thing that stood out was that people with disabilities said that a majority of people with disabilities said that election officials and polling places treated them respectfully and helpfully. Now, this did go down. This was slightly down from 2016, but I think it had to do with the pandemic, that there was that to deal with. But nevertheless, large numbers of people with disabilities were happy with how they were treated at the polls, and the respect that was shown to them. So I think that is really also is a great thing that we see. Now, the first part of your question, which was about registration, I think, again, it has to do with one size doesn't fit all, and having more options for how people can register to vote. I mean, a lot of people are registered at departments of motor vehicles. And again, that doesn't work for a lot of people with disabilities because they don't drive or they don't have cars. So having more places where people can register, possibly automatically registering people. I think there's also some information that needs to be provided. I think some people, historically, just saying, oh, I have an illness or a disability. Well, of course you're not going to vote. That was kind of the assumption going, for decades. And I think having more educational materials and more outreach saying, no, you can vote. We will figure out, how you can vote, and you're expected to vote. We want you to vote like every other citizen.
Thank you.
Oh, do you want to add something?
I was just going to add one really quick point, which is that the outreach and education and so forth are very important.
Yeah.
And people often say, well, we need to, develop new material for our website and get texts out and so forth. One limitation of that for people with disabilities is that they're less likely than people without disabilities to have internet access. I've actually, using a separate census data set, calculated in 2019 that 18% of people with disabilities live in homes without internet access and do not have cell phones. That's compared to only about 7% of people without disabilities. So that's almost 1 out of 5 people with disabilities don't have internet access. So of course there needs to be efforts to, through the internet, but it can't be just that.
Yeah, and it also goes to the issue of social isolation, that people with disabilities are less likely to hear about, to have the expectation of voting from work colleagues, from friends, from family. So again, greater outreach efforts are needed.
Thank you for that. I'm going to turn it over to my fellow commissioners. Vice Chair Hicks, do you have some questions?
I do. It's really interesting to hear that 20% of people with disabilities don't have internet access. That's a really high number. What role, if any, do you think alternative voting methods played in increasing turnout for people with disabilities? And as a follow-up, are there alternative voting methods responsible for the increase across all disability types and demographics?
That's a good question. We don't have, we did do some comparisons, found that states that expanded options over the past 4 years did have higher turnout of both among people with and without disabilities. But we don't find granular enough data to be able to tie this to specific, to the expansion of specific options. We do think, as we've said, that the more options, the better. Given the variation, the tremendous variation in the disability population, the types of limitations that people can face, having more options means there's a greater likelihood that you'll find something that works for you. For some people, it's obviously male voting if you have a mobility impairment. But if you have a visual impairment, it's more likely that you're going to be able to vote easily by going to a polling place where there's an accessible voting machine, as HAVA requires, the Help America Vote Act requires.
One interesting possibility is this electronic ballot delivery, where online you can fill out your ballot, then you print it out and send it back. But again, that requires internet access, and so that's not a great option for a lot of people with disabilities at this point. although that digital divide is shrinking, especially among younger people, but it's still very much there.
Yeah, the really nice thing about the electronic ballot delivery is that it does provide people with visual impairments a way to vote at home confidentially without relying on a family member or friend. And maybe sometimes you don't want your family member or friend to know how you voted. You certainly have the right to a secret ballot. So the electronic ballot delivery allows you to do all of that online while keeping it very secure. You're not submitting the ballot online with that system. You're still mailing it as with the standard mail ballot. So that particular option doesn't involve the same security problems that that arise when you submit a ballot online.
Thank you. Thank you. Commissioner McCormick.
So thank you for this. It's very interesting. You suggest that employment and civic involvement brings people with disabilities into the mainstream political life, as evidenced by the similar voter participation rates for disabled and non-disabled persons, voters. Is there a way to leverage this information to decrease the gap in voter registration?
Well, efforts to increase employment among people with disabilities are extremely important. That's the first thing. The ADA has had tremendous success in many areas, but the employment of people with disabilities has stayed stubbornly low. So only about a third of people with disabilities, with severe disabilities, are employed. And many of the people who are not employed say they would like to work and are able to work, but they can't get their foot in the door. There's a lot of resistance. So efforts to increase employment, to increase inclusion socially of people with disabilities are really important. We find no difference. I have to repeat this. We find no difference in participation in voting among employed people with and without disabilities. It's very, very clear.
Well, and you ask whether we can, how we might be able to leverage that information. The trying to disentangle, what's going on, why people with disabilities who are employed are more likely to vote. It really, as we try to disentangle that in past research, it is due to several things. One is the higher income. People with higher incomes are more likely to vote in general. So that does seem to that is tied to the higher turnout. But there is an important part to the civic skills as well, that people interact with others and learn how to make decisions, and that kind of has a spillover effect in being interested in participating. And then simply the social connections. You go to work, people ask, "Oh, have you voted yet?" Well, for people with disabilities, they aren't getting someone to ask them to have you voted yet. Something as simple as that. The having someone ask you, and past survey research has shown this, having someone ask you if you voted is a very powerful predictor of actually voting. The fact that employment helps overcome the social isolation is very important. So so those are several things to leverage if we can figure out how to not only increase the civic skills, but also the social connections for people with disabilities and their involvement in the community.
So, Mr. Chairman, I have other questions, but I guess we're going to take another round. Is that correct?
I'm going to try to do another round. I think that we got some time.
Okay.
Let's do that.
Okay.
Chairman Hovland, did you have a question?
Thank you. Yeah, and Professors Cruz and Schur, thank you for your work in this area. Actually, I was intrigued by something around that digital divide you mentioned, Professor Cruz. Have you seen any correlation or I guess any numbers that, was talked about earlier on voter registration, that Americans with disabilities are less likely to be registered at the DMV. And obviously that's for reasons of not driving, et cetera. And I guess I was also thinking a lot of state online voter registration systems are dependent on getting the signature from the DMV database. And so my initial thought was that maybe it's an issue there, but the digital divide issue, I think, raises another question. So I didn't know if you've seen any correlation between those two groups, or if there any research in that area.
A correlation between
I guess Americans with disabilities that don't have a driver's license and don't have internet access.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I would bet there is such a correlation,
But we
but we haven't
looked at it,
seen the
yeah.
data.
Fair enough. Next time.
Yeah, I'll just add one other note on that digital divide. As I said, almost 1/5 of people with disabilities don't have internet access. A good portion of that is due to senior citizens.
Right.
People who are getting gray hair like me are less likely to be connected to the internet in general. However, there is still a gap among working age people.
Yep.
Age 18 to 64. It's a smaller digital divide. I don't have the numbers right off the top of my head. It's a smaller digital divide, but there is still a digital divide among younger people with and without disabilities.
Useful. Well, thank you. I'll wait for the next round. Back to Chairman Palmer.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I'm going to shift just a bit to ask our EAC subject matter expert, Mr. Jackson, a question. Do you think, it's been an interesting couple of years. We've had some security grants and as well as CARES Act grants. And do you think that the increase in those grants had, assisted election officials in their ability to deploy and procure more accessible voting equipment? And do you think that and also use some of that money to make their polling places more accessible? Do you have any data on that? Do you believe that had a role in helping decrease that gap?
Yes, and I think so. And I want to highlight what the professor said earlier is that when you have these two targeted areas, the accessibility of the polling place, and then the size and the readability of the ballot, these were the two largest, barriers in accessibility from 2012. And then that's the two targeted areas that have shown that increase from 2012 to 2020. If the election officials have the tools, and one of those tools is finances, they're going to be able to close those gaps. And so we did see an increase in accessible machines and a decrease in the barriers in those areas. And so, yes, I do think that an increase in funding and a focus on these areas. So it's having the knowledge and the information that these are problems, whether the physical accessibility of polling places and the readability and the size, also enabling election officials to engage and solve those issues. They have control over that. And then if they have this increased fundings, then they're able to deploy not only, ensuring that the polling places are accessible and that they have the accessible machines, but then there are alternative voting methods for the individuals who cannot get to the polling places or would not be safe going to the polling places during the pandemic. So yeah, I think we can definitely take a look at the funding and see that there's a natural kind of progression in that area to increasing accessibility where you do have more resources and more funding.
I think that's right. And I think folks that are listening or watching should understand that the whole process of making a polling place accessible is really a multi-year process. You identify polling places. If there are polling places with, difficulties, you have to make some investments to make that more accessible. You need to think ahead and plan ahead. And So I think that I'm encouraged to see that the difficulties are coming down, but I think that election officials, I think the HAVA funding really did a lot to help them make those polling places more accessible. Vice Chair Hicks, did you want to start another round of questions here?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I think that's a great point that you've made about disability access. And I hope that as facilities and jurisdictions look to have polling places, that they actually look towards places that are more accessible, particularly government buildings and so forth, that are, as they go up, are more likely to have accessibility access for folks. For Mr. Jackson, thank you again for accepting our invitation to be an employee at our agency here. And I'm really looking forward to the division as they grow and do great things. I have a quick question of how can this long-term data gathering and research help election officials moving forward?
And I just want to reiterate those same points that the professors had, is that if we're looking at where the gaps have been closed from 2012 until now, that if election officials know where the difficulties lie, then they're able to address those issues. And as the chairman said, that this is a multi-year process. And so some of the planning that you see that, happen in maybe the 2018 election will be reflected in the 2022 election. And so as election officials can identify polling places that are in, close to the majority of the individuals in that precinct, that is accessible by public transportation, that is accessible, all these different factors can be addressed. But you need that long-term data. You need to say, okay, well, these are the reasons why individuals with disabilities are less likely to vote than individuals without disabilities. The digital divide is an issue, and so the electronic ballot delivery system is not going to be the panacea. The vote by mail is not going to, again, be that silver bullet. Is that that's not going to work necessarily for voters with fine motor coordination or visual impairments. And taking a look at the cross disability spectrum. So understanding that there are a number of different difficulties, but then there are also the same number of, solutions to these issues. Is that states that have, pioneered, either electronic ballot delivery or vote by mail have had these experiences in this 2020 election. They were able to share that information with other states that were just starting to deploy this technology. And so it really helps everyone to have this data, know where these kind of pain points are, and then, lean on other individuals who had been doing work in this area to, decrease these barriers as they start to deploy different alternative voting systems.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Hicks. Commissioner McCormick, did you have another question?
I want to get back to this digital divide issue and kind of follow up on what Commissioner Hovland was raising. Looking at your data, we have only 8.8% of voters with disabilities registering using the internet or online, and that even seems low given the numbers that you told us about the 20% approximately who don't have internet access. And most of them still registered at a Department of Motor Vehicles or at a town hall or county government registration office. Is there something inherent in the online registration? I mean, it might be what Commissioner Hovland was saying, some sort of hookup with DMV that causes voters with disabilities not to want to use that form of registration. It seems to me it would be an easier way for them to register.
It is for many people with disabilities. It depends upon the type of disability, and certainly, but yes, the just taking a step back, the internet has been tremendously valuable to many people with disabilities, allowing them to overcome social isolation in many ways through social media and so forth. So it's, and that applies here with voting registration, that it has been very, I'm certain it's been very valuable for many people with disabilities to be able to vote, to get election information and so forth through the internet. It is interesting, as we said, the people with disabilities are less likely to register to Department of Motor Vehicles. Still, many of them do, as you said. Many people with disabilities do drive.
It should, yeah, your study shows that most of them actually register still through the DMV, which I found interesting.
Yeah, and plenty of people with disabilities drive. Just they're less likely to do so than people without disabilities.
Right. And I guess I'm just wondering if there's something with the online system that creates some sort of a barrier for them to use that and include, I mean, given that, 20% of them don't have internet access, but it's still a very low number. It's still half of how many people register online who don't have disabilities. So I'm just,
Yeah,
we need to make that more accessible somehow. Is that something we need to look at?
well,
Yeah,
we absolutely need
Yeah.
to make sure that that online systems are accessible, and that's a big issue in general. Making sure that websites
absolutely. Yeah.
are accessible.
The other thing I would say would be outreach, that there could be many people with disabilities who don't know that they can register online. And so I would suggest efforts in that area as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner McCormick. Commissioner Hovland?
Yeah, I wanted to go back to, I mean, I think there's some pretty awesome numbers here, and I think progress. I think what I take away from this study is, there are a number of factors and a number of challenges across the disability community on reasons for not participating. Some of those are societal, some of those are campaigns could do a better job. But when we drill down to the election administration community, you see those advancements. I mean, the 26% of Americans with disabilities that had some difficulty in 2012 to the 11% in 2020. I mean, that's huge progress. And I feel like we know from other social science work, if you have a good experience voting, you're more likely to vote again in the future. So, I'm very heartened by that and the progress. And again, of course, we see there's still a gap and there's still work to do. And so I guess really for Professors Cruz and Schur and Ben Jackson, just like looking at that and thinking about the progress we've made, but the work that's left, do you have professors' recommendations for more work that the EAC can look at or areas to take on to? And then for Ben, as you think about, this new role that you're in with the agency and how we're going to, do more here, how to utilize resources like this research, somewhat like Commissioner Hicks was asking about, to make products that make a difference for election officials that in turn make a difference for voters. Thank you.
Well, that's a really good question. We don't. I guess our basic message is EAC and election officials should keep doing what they're doing in terms of being aggressive in trying to address these problems. So we don't. There's been a lot of progress, and that's such a good thing, as we've all recognized. But in terms of specific policies, specific actions, we don't really have a lot of expertise there.
I guess I even mean areas that we should try to drill down more on, study to get some of the answers. I think we've hit on something here on certainly the voter registration issue, but I think again, one of the challenges that clearly persists is, as I think your studies have confirmed, that mail ballots are great for a number of Americans, but clearly there's accessibility gaps with vision impaired Americans on that method of voting and how we make it easier for them. So just I guess in that vein, other areas to drill down on.
Actually, that's exactly what I was going to mention, is that that would be one to drill down on,
Yeah.
is figuring out how to address the issues confronting people with vision impairments, especially with mail ballots. If it's electronic ballot
Yeah.
delivery or some other system that can be used. So I would agree that that's one that I would highlight.
And I would also say again, you know, addressing that digital divide. So recognizing that just getting messages out electronically is not going to do it for many people with disabilities, and alternative ways of presenting information, getting out information, getting out the messages is important.
Thank you. And Ben.
Right. And so, you know, it's a, I hate to say this, but it's a complex issue, right? So when we're looking at these issues of accessibilities and barriers, we have the actual barriers and the perceived barriers. And as you had mentioned, voters that have, you know, a good first time voting experience are more likely to vote again. So we're going to go back to the 1.9 million voters with disabilities who had actual barriers that they faced in the 2020 election, and try to ensure that we can get information out to them to let them know that whatever barriers that they faced previously, we're working to mitigate those. And so, you know, and again, when we're looking at the social and civic involvement, we want to make sure that we are counteracting, you know, if they have these bad experiences, they might tell other voters with disabilities, we had these terrible experiences, and you had these conversations. We want to interrupt those conversations and say, we understand that these barriers happen, but we're working to fix them. That, you know, these are our proposed solutions, that we understand, we hear what's going on, and now we're going to be here to address that. And so again, it's alternative voting systems. And so we're making sure that, you know, if vote by mail doesn't necessarily work, well, HAVA necessitates that there's an accessible voting system within the polling place. But maybe there's still difficulty getting from, you know, the parking lot to into the polling facility. We're going to try to make sure all the polling places are accessible, but, you know, curbside voting might work for you, that we're rolling out as many accessible voting options that are safe and secure for voters to really reduce, you know, these barriers, and to highlight what your previous point was, and also Commissioner McCormick, is we're going to try to look at this voter registration gap and say, the digital divide is not responsible for this entirety, but maybe there are issues with the accessibility of the forms online, that they might have PDFs, but they might not be readable based on the software somebody's using, or they might not be fillable. If they're readable and fillable, can they print it out and return it? Can they return it electronically? That we're going to be taking a look at every single step of the process to ensure that there is accessibility there. And then also, if it's, you know, not only the DMV is responsible for voter registration, but there are other state agencies that are directly related to working with voters with disabilities, and ensuring that, we can provide best practices and information to those other agencies to ensure that they have the materials that they need to assist voters in their process, and ensure that they're fulfilling what they're supposed to be doing and providing accessible voter registration options for voters. So, again, it's very complicated. There's, different policies that can be in place. There's different technologies that can be utilized, but, we're definitely going to be looking at best practices and trying to disseminate information to reduce those barriers.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Hovland. I think that's all we have today, time for today. I will say that the one thing I did note that I found very interesting is communication to voters with disabilities is very important. And as you go down to the state and the local level, I can see that's an area that we could all improve. And I think that that might be another subject for another hearing, but not today. Thank you to Professor Cruz and Schur who joined us today, and for Ben Jackson to the EAC for sharing his thoughts as well. I'd like to acknowledge again all the hard work that state and local election officials continue to do to serve all voters in their states and in their jurisdictions. We hope to see the data on voters with disabilities discussed continue to improve over the years. There's still work to be done, but election officials should be proud of the progress made. EAC will continue to examine the best ways to assist election officials as they continue their critical work to ensure that voters with disabilities can cast a secure and private ballot. Thank you all for joining us and participating. And without that, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank
Now,
you.
thank you. Thank you all.